When you start a new project, like we're going to this Lent, reading a book like Matthew, there's a sense both of excitement and also that this is actually a bit daunting. It's like setting off to climb a mountain only to discover that the beginning of the pathway is a lot steeper than you might have thought. And a lot of people find that when they start reading the New Testament as a whole, let alone just this Gospel of Matthew, that the first page hits them in the face. It's a list of names. You may have heard of 3 or 4 of these characters, but you probably haven't heard of too many more than that. What are you going to do about that? How are you going to get into what Matthew is actually wanting to tell you as you read through his book during Lent, or at least indeed any other time? The point of what Matthew is doing right from the start is to say, God has a plan, and this plan involves a family, and through that family, God is going to do something like you'd never have imagined. But so then he gives you this family tree, which, as I say, goes from Abraham all the way through David, through the exile, and on until we finally get to Jesus himself. Most of the people in that list we don't know very much about, but we know what the key moments were, and we know what Matthew was trying to do when he was telling us that this is Jesus' family tree. He wants to say, this is the story of the people of Abraham. And if you know anything about the Old Testament, you know that Abraham is the beginning of God's purpose to rescue not just one family, but the whole world. And then he wants to say, this is the story of how God's promises about King David came true as well. And again, if you know a bit about the Old Testament, you know that the point about David and his kingdom was that David was not just going to be king of Israel, but his descendants were going to be kings of the whole world. So the thing starts to fit together. But then the story goes into a slump, and Matthew draws our attention to this because 2/3 of the way through this family tree, those people go off into exile, and then they're brought back, but they're still waiting for the real thing to happen. And Matthew is saying, yes, even this great purpose of God has to go down right into the darkness in order to come through and out the other side to the moment we've all been waiting for. So we're not then surprised when Jesus is born and when the angel tells Joseph that you're going to call him Jesus because he will rescue his people from their sins. The people are in a mess and Jesus is going to rescue them. And that's not the only name this little boy is given. The other name, a very strange one, again goes back to the Old Testament, and it's the name Emmanuel, which means God with us. So right from the start, actually, if we can keep our nerve through that first page of Matthew, we have a sense of a big picture. This is the story of God's people. This is the story of God's king. And, breathtakingly, this is the story of God himself, coming to rescue his people, coming to be for his people what he'd always wanted to be. And then, if we're asking about what is Matthew doing right through his gospel, we get to the very end of the book. We flip across to chapter 28, and we find right at the end Jesus saying, I am with you always, even to the end of the world. It's all come true in Jesus, and now the mission of God is going out into the whole world, which is, of course, where we come in. When you look at a book like this, it's important to see that big picture, but then when we start to delve into the details, there's all sorts of other things going on as well. And I would urge you at some point during Lent, if you can, to sit down and read Matthew right through at a run. There's so much in it, you won't be able to remember 2/3 of it, but that doesn't matter. Get the feel and the flow of it, as if you were listening to a great piece of music that would be sweeping you along. Even if you couldn't remember this or that bit afterwards, you would get the whole feel and flavour of it. And you discover as you do that with Matthew, that his book has a particular feature to it which is peculiar to what he's doing over against the other Gospels. Matthew has arranged his material about Jesus, the teaching of Jesus in particular, into 5 great blocks. Yes, like the 5 books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers and Deuteronomy, that begin the Old Testament. Matthew is saying it's as though Jesus is like a new Moses, giving the people not just a new law, but a new covenant, a new code, a new way of life. So we find in chapters 5, 6 and 7, that's the first great block, what we call the Sermon on the Mount. And then in chapter 10, Jesus teaching his followers as he sends them out on their own mission, in line with what he's doing. And then in chapter 13, right at the middle of the book, we have the great parable chapter, the parable of the sower and the other parables. Then in chapter 18, we have Jesus teaching his people about one particular aspect of living as kingdom people, which is hugely important, and we'll come back to that later. And then the last great block, chapters 23, 24 and 25, which are looking ahead to the way in which God is bringing all the threads of the story together, both in judgment and in mercy. This is the true charter, Matthew is saying, for God's people. And in the middle of it all, Jesus is launching what he calls the kingdom of heaven. Now, people get puzzled about this because many people in our culture, when they hear that phrase, kingdom of heaven, they assume that it means a place called heaven where God's people go after they die. That certainly isn't what Matthew means by it, and it certainly isn't what Jesus meant by it either. In the Old Testament and also in Matthew here, what we find meaning by heaven is that heaven is where God lives, but the rule of heaven is not that you go to heaven in order to be ruled over by God, but that God in heaven is now beginning to rule on earth as in heaven. So if you look at the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6 and 7, and look at the way it's focused on one little passage in the middle, that little passage is what we call the Lord's Prayer. And the Lord's Prayer itself is focused in the middle on thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as in heaven. This is about how God becomes king through Jesus on earth. And so we see this agenda going forward. It's an astonishingly sophisticated piece of writing, actually, but it's also extremely accessible, like a great symphony that's got all sorts of musical artistry, but still has plenty of good tunes that you can whistle after you leave the concert hall. And the story develops all around the way that Jesus himself is gradually being understood as the one through whom God's kingdom is coming, so that in the middle of the book we find Jesus saying to his followers, who do people say that the Son of Man is? And they say, well, folk are saying this, folk are saying that, but who do you say that I am, says Jesus. And Peter blurts it out. He says, you're the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Now that was odd because Jesus wasn't doing the sort of things you'd expect a Messiah to do. He wasn't raising an army to fight a battle against the Romans. He wasn't planning to rebuild the temple. Those were sorts of things that royal personages had done in Israel before him and would try and do again, actually. But Peter and the others have pierced through to a secret hidden identity that actually the very concept of messiahship, of God's anointed king, is as it were being redefined around Jesus. That's a huge risk, and as we shall see later on, that's a risk which Jesus knew about and was going into with his eyes wide open. It is all being redefined around him. The whole point is that now Jesus is to be enthroned as the true king, as the King of the Jews. How is that going to happen? Well, as the story proceeds, with these great 5 blocks of teaching keeping us on the way step by step, as the story proceeds, we see Jesus deciding it's time to go to Jerusalem. It's time to make the decisive move. If God is going to become king on earth as in heaven, something's got to be done. There is a battle, not the battle people were expecting a Messiah to fight, but a very different sort of battle. And so as the book reaches its climax, we see Jesus heading for Jerusalem, knowing that he has to fight the great battle when he gets there. But the whole point that Matthew is making is that this is how God becomes king on earth as in heaven. And so when we get right through to the end of the book, through Jesus' crucifixion and through to his resurrection, we discover this is where it was all going. This book functions both as the story of Jesus and as the story of how God's age-old purposes had come together in Jesus, and as the foundation for who Jesus' followers are now supposed to be. And if we are reading Matthew during Lent, it's probably because we intend to be part of that company of Jesus' followers, so that as we read and as we ponder and as we pray, we look long and hard at Jesus and say, what did it mean then and what does it mean now for God to become king on earth as in heaven?